What happens when your job is to be beautiful, silent, and entirely owned, body and soul, by the most powerful man in the world? In the Roman Empire, beauty was currency, and if you were a boy with the wrong kind of beauty, the delicate cheekbones, the amber eyes, the body that hadn't yet hardened into adulthood, you weren't admired. You were claimed, not like a citizen, like a possession, like wine or silk or a singing bird in a gilded cage. The Romans didn't use the word concubine the way we do now. In Latin, concubinus was a specific kind of person, a male companion, often a slave, kept by a wealthy man for his private pleasure. Not just sexual, though that was usually part of it. A concubinus was decor, luxury, symbol, servant, and silent confidant, all in one. And unlike a wife, he could never become legitimate. He existed entirely in the shadow. Let's start where many of these boys started. The auction block. Some were war captives, plucked from conquered provinces in Gaul or Asia Minor, their homes burned behind them, their native languages still raw in their throats. Others were born into slavery, groomed from the cradle, and a few were sold by desperate parents, promised a better life in the care of a rich Roman household. Trainers, yes, there were trainers, would evaluate their bodies, their posture, their hair. They were taught how to walk, how to bathe, how to speak only when spoken to. They were taught not to flinch when touched. One Roman satirist, Martial, wrote of a boy slave who was so beautiful his owner refused to let him speak because the sound of his voice might spoil the illusion. That's what it meant to be a male concubine, to be something ornamental, perfect, and never quite real. At 12, you were considered just the right age. By 15, you were aging out. By 17, you were a has-been. The lucky ones were retired into other roles: cupbearers, chamber servants, entertainers. The unlucky ones were discarded, sold off, or quietly erased. And the truth is, no law protected you. Rome had laws about property, about land boundaries, even about the proper shape of a water jug. But a boy slave, you weren't a citizen, you were meat. If you were pleasing, you stayed. If you rebelled, you bled. One famous Roman, the orator Cicero, had a male concubine named Pindarus. There are letters where Cicero casually refers to him as delightful company and a comforting warmth on cold night, but he never once called him human. And emperors, they made things worse. Nero, infamous for everything from fiddling to fratricide, had a boy concubine named Sporus. When Nero's wife died, possibly by his own hands, he claimed Sporus resembled her, so he had him castrated, dressed in royal women's robes, and married him in a public ceremony. The empire cheered. Sporus was renamed Sabina and paraded as empress. Let that settle in. A boy carved and renamed, forced to reenact the dead. This wasn't romance. It was power at its ugliest, and it was tragically common. We tend to imagine Roman decadence as adult orgy, statues, wine cups overflowing. But for the boys inside the palace walls, it was quieter than that, more insidious. Imagine sleeping in a chamber next to the atrium, trained to wake at the rustle of a silk robe, to smile before your eyes even opened. Imagine being a status symbol at dinner, more admired than the silver plate you held, but no freer than it. And God's help you if your owner died. You might be buried with him, literally, because Rome also had a fondness for grave goods. Some concubines were sealed inside tombs with their masters. Others were sacrificed, poisoned, or strangled, so their spirits could serve forever. Sporus, by the way, didn't outlive his role. After Nero's death, he was passed around like a cursed relic. Finally, he killed himself. Historians say he preferred that to being used in another emperor's entertainment. And that's the kind of story you don't hear in Latin class, because the Roman Empire wasn't just built on legions, aqueducts, and marble. It was built on silence, especially the kind forced from a boy's mouth. By now, you've realized that being a male concubine in the Roman Empire wasn't some scandalous luxury. It was quiet captivity, gilded and masked by words like favor, companion, or delight. But what happened inside those walls, behind the velvet drapes, the marble columns, and the elaborate togas, wasn't recorded in epic poetry. It survived only in rumors, satire, and the occasional bone. The Roman domus, an elite home, was a machine of hierarchy, and deep inside that machine, tucked behind the tablinum and past the peristyle garden, there was often a space with no name, a back room, a curtained alcove, a private chamber. That's where the concubinus waited. They weren't household staff. not officially. They weren't family. They didn't sleep in the slave quarters either. Their bed was usually closer, much closer. You'll find it mentioned obliquely in letters and estate records. One inventory of a wealthy senator's villa near Pompeii lists a cedar couch, 2 gold-threaded pillows, and 1 Greek boy, all in the same line item, as if the boy, too, was furniture. In these private quarters, everything was performance, not love, not even lust. The boy had to radiate submission, graceful, pliant, adoring, but also be invisible when not needed. He had to anticipate, not react. His survival depended on it. There were rules, unspoken ones. Don't show jealousy if another boy is brought in. Don't cry unless it's aesthetically pleasing. Don't forget to bathe twice daily, and always use oil, not water, on the master's skin, and absolutely never grow a beard. Boys were loved only while they remained boys. The Roman poet Catullus once wrote bitterly about a man who prefers smooth cheeks to honest hearts. He wasn't wrong. In fact, the moment a concubinus's voice cracked or he showed signs of puberty, his value plummeted. Some masters tried to delay the process. One method, castration. Romans officially frowned upon the practice, but it happened, especially in the East or in private villas where no magistrate cared to ask questions. There's evidence of entire prep schools for male concubines in Asia Minor, places where Greek and Anatolian boys were taught Latin phrases, music, and how to dance in soft slippers before being sold to Roman households. Many were surgically altered before puberty. That wasn't just cruelty, that was preservation. And if you're wondering what it did to the boys psychologically, so are historians. The problem is, the boys never wrote. They weren't allowed to. Slaves couldn't legally publish, couldn't testify, couldn't leave memoirs. But once in a while we hear an echo. A graffiti scrawl on a wall in Herculaneum reads, "Felix, beloved of M, is no longer a boy, but still weeps like one." Who was Felix? We don't know, but someone missed him, or mourned him, or wished they hadn't outlived the favor of their owner. By the age of 16, many concubini were already relics. If they were still alive, they might become body servants, torchbearers for banquets, or, rarely, teachers for younger boys. A few, oddly, climbed even higher. There are examples of former concubines who became imperial advisors. The Emperor Hadrian had a famously intense relationship with Antinous, a Greek youth who accompanied him across the empire. When Antinous drowned mysteriously in the Nile, Hadrian declared him a god. He founded an entire city in his name, built temples, commissioned statues, but even then, Antinous didn't escape objectification. His deification was less about reverence and more about aesthetic obsession. Rome didn't mourn him as a man, it worshipped him as a beautiful corpse. So what does survival look like in this world? It looks like silence, like stillness, like knowing when to smile and when to disappear. It means learning your master's moods better than your own. It means never aging. And when you do, you hope the next room you're sent to has a window, because most didn't. So what happens when a boy trained to be perfect finally stops being perfect? In Rome, the answer depended on how lucky or how disposable you were. If your master was sentimental, you might be reassigned. You might become a body servant or a valet. Or if you were particularly clever, a secretary. There are records of older concubini becoming scribes, attending their former masters at public events, or managing household affairs. That was the dream, the soft landing. But that wasn't the usual story. More often, you were sold, sometimes discreetly, sometimes not. Roman slave markets had sections for trained houseboys. A 20-year-old who'd once been the prized companion of a senator could now find himself stripped naked on a wooden platform, oiled like a roast pig, and bid on by strangers. You weren't sacred anymore. You were secondhand. There's a document from 2nd century Ostia, a transaction log, that lists the sale of Lucius, a eunuch of former noble service, age 19, literate and quiet, eyes dark. The price? Slightly less than a fine saddle. For those without a buyer, the options were bleaker. Temple labor, low-level brothels, domestic drudgery. Some ended up in the baths, not as guests, but as attendants, scrubbing tiles and fetching towels for Roman elites who might have once stroked their hair and whispered false endearments. And then there was the theater. In some households, concubini were taught to sing or dance, not just for entertainment, but as part of their appeal. These skills didn't go unnoticed. Rome's stages were full of ex-concubines, turned performers. You might think that sounds like freedom, but Roman theater wasn't art, it was spectacle. A eunuch actor wasn't respected. He was ogled, laughed at, groped from the audience. If you were unlucky enough to gain notoriety, you became property again, this time of the crowd. One graffiti in Pompeii mocks a performer by name. Marcus sings like a girl because he was one until he bled. Even laughter had teeth. And outside the city walls, there was the army, but not for you. Eunuchs couldn't serve, nor could slaves or former slaves. The empire was vast, but the paths forward for someone like you were narrow, thorny, and usually came with a leash. So some tried to disappear. They shaved their heads, took menial jobs, pretended to be mute. There's a burial site in southern Gaul that contains a skeleton of a person marked male by bone structure, but with distinct hormonal anomalies, likely caused by prepubescent castration. Buried alone, no name, no possessions, just a plain tile above the grave, etched with a single word, Sylvanus. Maybe that was the name, or the name given, or a final joke, but even anonymity wasn't always safe. Roman society had a cruel memory. Once you'd been known as someone's concubinus, your reputation stuck like oil in marble cracks. People remembered, whispers followed. A grown man with soft features might be laughed at, avoided, called names, Sinaiadus, Moles, or worse. Some concubini did the unthinkable. They turned the power dynamic on its head. There are rare, fascinating cases in Roman legal records where former concubines sued their owners, sometimes for freedom, sometimes for promised inheritances. One such case, brought before Emperor Claudius, involved a boy named Glycon. He'd served a wealthy noble for 8 years and was promised manumission. When it didn't come, he filed a petition. Claudius granted it. Why? Not out of mercy, because Glycon was valuable. That's the bitter truth. Freedom came not from justice, but from utility. If you were beautiful and compliant, you were owned. If you were clever and useful, you might be free. But if you were broken, or tired, or simply too old, you vanished, and no one built a statue for you. By the end of it all, the boy was usually gone. Not dead, necessarily, but erased. Roman history was meticulous about wars, emperors, and temple dedications. It cataloged triumphs and treaties, bathhouses and bricks, but it had no interest in remembering the small, painful lives of the soft-voiced boys who warmed the feet of generals and smiled through dinner parties. And that was the point. The concubinus was never supposed to last. He existed to please, not persist, to fill a space, not shape one, to offer up youth like it was a meal and disappear before it's spoiled. So how do we even know they existed? Not from journals, not from statues, not from the clean Latin marble liked by textbooks. We find them instead in the margin, in scratched wall insults, in the snide verses of poets, in medical texts complaining about effeminate slaves who caused moral decline. We hear them in the background of moral panics and satire, whispers of decadence, warnings of corruption. But sometimes, just sometimes, there's more. An epitaph from a villa in the Sabine Hills reads, "To Aelius, my boy, more faithful than friends, warmer than wives. May the gods treat you better than Rome did." Who wrote it? No one knows. But in that one brittle stone, you see everything that was never supposed to be said aloud. That someone loved the boy, or thought they did, or at least missed him when he was gone. The Roman Empire built aqueducts, paved roads, and carved its laws into bronze. But its softer truths, the ones that hurt and bend and disappear, were etched in silence. And that's the tragedy. These boys didn't vanish because they mattered too little. They vanished because they mattered only in private, because what they gave couldn't be named, because their pain wasn't useful, and because once they became men, they stopped being beautiful. In a world obsessed with image, they were the reflection no one wanted to keep. So what lingers? A few words, a forgotten name, the faint echo of bare feet on mosaic floors. No statues remain, but maybe they were never supposed to. Maybe they knew that. And maybe, when the curtain fell for the last time, the only real freedom they had was the chance to disappear entirely into the blank space between the glory and the grief.